Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We partner with businesses, organisations, trade unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2022, Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn's dust diseases team have accumulated more than 20 years of experience in asbestos litigation and pride themselves on ensuring that their clients not only receive their best compensation result, but that they are supported during their stressful and traumatic time. And Maurice Blackburn Lawyers are looking for a passionate full-time associate to join their dust diseases team in their Brisbane office. To apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast out each Friday that dives into the progressive campaign issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And we head over to the Emerald Isle, the land of my fathers, to mark St. Patrick's Day. We actually tried to line this episode up a while ago, well, actually for St. Patrick's Day, but just couldn't get it together. But on today's show, we are joined by David Kitching, who is a campaign consultant, but a Labor Party man at heart, and is on the show to talk about, he's got a whole experience in Europe and geopolitics, but he's here today to talk about Brexit and the implications that Brexit had on the relationship between the North of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the relationship between Ireland and Britain. We're also going to talk a bit about Irish unity and the prospect of a united 32-county Irish Republic. And we have a bit of a chat about the Labor Party in the Republic as well. So an excellent episode this week for those of you who are interested in Anglo-Irish affairs. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, to be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And for all the latest updates, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday evening in Wurundjeri land in the heart of Melbourne. This episode actually was meant to be our St. Patrick's Day special. We did one last year and we're going to do another one this year, but unfortunately we couldn't get our stars to align with our guest. But nonetheless, we have him on the phone now. He's a communications advocacy research policy consultant based in Dublin. David Kitching, Fáilte go Sóisialta Déanlacht agus le féile porg sona ditch. I hope my Irish is really, really rusty. I haven't been to class in quite some time, and I must admit I had to double check my pronunciation before I did that. I hope I probably didn't butcher that, but anyway.
You're doing better than some people who have studied Irish in school, so don't worry.
You're too kind. Welcome to Socially Democratic. We've got you on the show today. I just wanted to sort of have a bit of a chat about Irish politics in general, but also the issue at the moment with Brexit and the implications that's had on the border, and then the implications that the border has had on the question about Irish unity. And maybe we'll get a chance, if we have some time, to talk a bit about the Labor Party as well and how things are tracking, because there's obviously been some great news recently with the by-election success that the party's had. But to start off with Brexit, I wanted to talk to you first, and if you can set the scene for a lot of us down here in Australia so we can understand the complications that occurred with Northern Ireland when Britain voted to leave the European Union.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I was living in London at the time of the referendum, and it became patently obvious that it was just not on the radar in terms of all of the discourse around how people talked about it. Even the Remain campaign didn't talk about it to any great degree. They tried to give an economic argument against Brexit, which didn't really resonate in something that was, they're running against a much more visceral, emotional campaign. And, I know that the Irish government at the time, the former Taoiseach Enda Kenny, had come over to try and you persuade at least the Irish diaspora within the UK to vote against it. There were occasional articles written in newspapers and that kind of thing, and it just wasn't a major part of the conversation. And whenever I talk to British friends and people I meet through work and that kind of thing, like what a lot of people say now is that just the lack of teaching of Irish history within the British education system has had a huge role to play, because there is a massive asymmetry. We all learn about British history in school. We know who their former prime ministers were. We know about the major events, because for a long time they were our events too, prior to independence. And I think Irish people have an understanding of our nearest neighbour the way they do not of us, and it is a long history. That kind of asymmetry. I suppose if you're to look at like how people within the two countries identify themselves, there's often this kind of competition of relative majorities. So like British people always define themselves with respect to the rest of Europe, and we see that played out in Brexit. Irish people often define themselves with respect to the UK, and with Irish independence, we went from having like an Irish nationalist minority in the UK to a majority in the newly formed Ireland. And with that, the unionist minority was mainly based in the northeast, from what became Northern Ireland, and that was built to manufacture a unionist majority within that new statelet. So there's always been this interplay of the larger versus the smaller player, and that ultimately played out in terms of how people viewed Brexit within the UK. And Ireland was, to a degree, since the Good Friday Agreement, was sort of out of sight, out of mind. And even you see certain elements of discourse, at least on social media. I'm not saying this is representative, but when Irish people tried to weigh in and give warnings, we're told to stay out of it. It's none of your business. It doesn't affect you, and totally oblivious to the fact that it really does. And especially if you're from either side of the border region, the massive impact it has. There are so many people who live in Northern Ireland and work in the Republic, or vice versa. It's a really common story about people having their situation upended, whether it's work, whether it's school, family relations, all of that kind of thing. It really does affect so many people, but that was just not a part of the conversation. Or if it was at least on the radar, it was deliberately kept quiet.
For our Australian audience, talk about the changes that occurred with the Good Friday Agreement in terms of the border, and how then this became a problem when Britain then voted to leave the European Union, because obviously the Republic is a member of the European Union. Northern Ireland is a member of the UK as part of the European Union, and then they leave, and then what implication that has with the Good Friday Agreement.
Sure. So ostensibly, there are three strands to the Good Friday Agreement. So three key relationships that had to be addressed. And so the Good Friday Agreement, first of all, it recognised that sometimes there's this kind of trite summation of the Northern Ireland conflict, that it was some kind of competition of religious animosity or atavism and this kind of thing. It wasn't. The Good Friday Agreement recognised that it was a conflict of competing nationalisms, of British nationalism or Ulster-Unionism, and of Irish nationalism, and therefore it addressed that competition through those three strands. So the first was the north-south element, so between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. East-west was between Ireland as a whole and Britain, and then the internal relationship between the two predominant communities within Northern Ireland. So it went to great pains to try and address each of those strands in great detail, making an awful lot of constitutionally creative fudges to allow that to become a reality. But there was a fourth element that wasn't always given due recognition, and that is that it's pretty likely that it wouldn't have been possible to reach the Good Friday Agreement without both countries being members of the European Union. And the reason for this is that the EU was a very creative project in its own way, in terms of it totally recategorized how people in Europe view sovereignty. So going from this old kind of Westphalian concept of hard borders and, I'm sovereign over this territory and you're over there. It created a concept of pool sovereignty through pooling certain economic and political interests. And with both Ireland and the UK being part of that overall club with pool sovereignty, it really dissolved the kind of hardness of that border, and made it much more possible to envisage a case where it was a part of the same customs union and part of a broader context where it wasn't just Ireland being a small partner dominated by a larger UK. We were in a club with other large and small countries. It created a context in which the Good Friday Agreement was much easier to sell to our respective publics. Because there was a very similar agreement developed in 1972, the Sunningdale Agreement, which had a number of similar strands. And subsequently, Seamus Mallon, the former SDLP deputy leader, once described the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners, because the SDLP had created the draft of that agreement and then brought other people on board, and then it took everyone else many years to get with the program, so to speak. So the Good Friday Agreement was it was a function of a context created by the European Union. You wouldn't give the EU the sole credit for it, but it created a context in which it was much more possible. And then you had governments in both countries that were willing to expend some political capital on passing it. So at the time, you had the Blair government in the UK and you had the Ahern government in Ireland, and they had recognised these dynamics around it being competing nationalisms. And even John Major, to give him some credit, he's one of the rare conservative prime ministers who actually showed some understanding of the conflict too, because very few of them before or after him have done.
So we had this Good Friday Agreement, this notion of a border. I mean, obviously during the Troubles, it was a hard border. But if you go to the Republic or if you go to the north of Ireland now, you can drive back and forth over it as many times as you like, and there's no one there at all to check your passport. Brexit happens, and now all of a sudden, one part of the island is not in the European Union, but the other part is, and then trade becomes a problem.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to think about this. Before we talk about that, but I just want to get a sense of what the voting population within the Northern Ireland were thinking when they voted, because the majority of the statelet did vote to remain. But obviously there were some constituencies that obviously voted to leave. I don't want to get you to, could you break that down for me? Give us a sense of who was wanting to stay, who was wanting to go.
Yeah, so it was when I was based in London during that time. I was working in a research agency and I had access to a kind of facility where I would basically add a couple of questions to omnibus polls that were going out on a regular basis. And basically the supplier owed me a few favors, so I took them up on that, and I'd use it for our own publicity, to be honest. But I added a lot of questions in relation to Brexit and looking at kind of age and regional demographics, and we couldn't go into great depth, but got enough to get a sense that I pretty much knew by the time the referendum was coming around that it was going to be a vote for Brexit. And we booked our holidays for the following day just to get out of Dodge for a while. But part of the reason that I knew it was going to go that way was the age demographics skewed far older across the whole UK now, and then regionally, just London, Scotland, and Northern Ireland were the areas that were voting to remain, and it wasn't going to be enough to carry it. Within Northern Ireland, just in terms of your question of the demographic breakdown, it did break down on the old communal lines to a large degree, but skewing older for Brexit supporters. There's there are significant issues within political unionism now. The distinct lack of leadership that they have shown for the past number of years has done a huge amount of damage, both to their communities, but also actually to their political cause in a large degree. The Democratic Unionist Party has been for the last number of years the largest party of political unionism. They made a big bet on Brexit. Even they took a lot of dark money that was involved in the Leave campaign and launched adverts in Britain, so not just within Northern Ireland. I think their bet was that a hard Brexit would lead to a reinstatement of a more emphatically unionist UK, and would shore up the union rather than imperil it. And a lot of younger people in particular have been quite disenchanted with this. The DUP has quite a large farming agricultural voting base, and with the removal of the common agricultural policy and the supports that go with it, they will end up imperiling the economic future of a good number of their voters in those kind of rural areas. Also, there's a huge amount of support that the EU has given to Northern Ireland as a post-conflict zone, and while the EU's keen to keep some of those up, it still changes the context, and it changes the manner in which the politics around this plays out. So we're seeing an increased kind of decoupling of younger people from a unionist background from political unionism, and some people will go more reactionary. They'll go towards parties like the Traditional Unionist Voice. Some might go to the Ulster Unionist Party, the slightly more moderate representation of mainstream unionism, and then some are moving away from that kind of bifurcated unionist nationalist system altogether and supporting parties like the Alliance Party and the Green Party. And it's become pretty obvious over time that the DUP has failed a large number of its constituencies. You see, if you travel around Belfast and you go through nationalist or unionist areas, there's a stronger sense of activity and civil society in nationalist areas now than you would see in unionist areas. There's greater dilapidation. To a certain degree, the problems of unemployment and austerity have impacted those areas to a larger degree than nationalist areas as well. So it's been a failing political ideology, and their efforts to make a fast move to shore up political unionism have seemingly failed. Now, we don't know how this will play out in the coming months and years, because there's still capacity for damage to be done if the protocol is upended, or if we don't know what kind of behaviour is still encouraged within the Westminster government either.
I want to come to the protocol in a moment. Just to pick up on that point, though, you were talking about before about the disillusionment of the sort of the political unionist base. When I was in Ireland in 2018, we went up to Belfast and we did one of the black cab tours, which, if anyone does visit the city, I highly recommend doing.
Yeah, they're great.
They're fantastic. And I did one in 2002 or 2003. So the Good Friday Agreement it was still the ink was still pretty fresh. And then to go back, so many years later and then do another one, it was actually an interesting contrast. The driver that we had was from a unionist background. And I remember when we parked near the Peace Wall, and he, by that stage, was sort of getting a bit familiar with us and feeling a bit more comfortable. He let rip. He absolutely ripped into the DUP and said that they are, he was just completely off them. He said, let's forget about the unionist Republican stuff. Like, them as a political party, their policies on their social policies, their economic policies, their environmental policies, they're batshit crazy. This is just not mainstream centrist government stuff they're talking about, And he said that he's voting Alliance now. And I just thought that was interesting for someone who is in that industry, of which he is from the Shankill. Walking away. And he's older. Like, this guy was in he was raised through the Troubles. His kids, at high school, and they don't give a shit about any of this sort of stuff. And when he talked about stuff, I think his dad's having a laugh. But fascinating to just get an insight into that generation even walking away.
It's very telling, because even in post-conflict areas, people, there's a tendency, I suppose, to turn a blind eye to certain things that are fairly obvious. But by the DUP, in terms of, you mentioned some of the social policies and its views around around I suppose the social liberal issues like equal marriage or reproductive rights and that kind of thing, or the way they talk about minorities. So oftentimes their behaviour is that of a far right party, and there comes a point where if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck, and because of the sensitivity around needing to have a power sharing agreement as part of the post Good Friday Agreement setup, they were the largest party of political unionism, and therefore everyone else had to work with them. But they've the capacity to do an awful lot of damage, and they have done so far. They're weakening now, and they're going through one crisis after another internally as well. Like they changed leadership some time ago, and when Edwin Poots took over, who's a creationist and very strange character, he lasted, I think, a month or something like that before he was ousted again. And the level of, I suppose, political cowardice where he took the party leadership but didn't take the position of First Minister, which would normally go with that. They're in quite a degree of disarray, and to be honest, it's deserved. It's hard to feel any sympathy for them. They sold their population down to Swanee, and that includes unionist people, not just the nationalist community.
So this gamble that they made has obviously backfired, and it's backfired in a way in which the UK government have introduced this protocol. Can you explain what exactly this protocol means and why this is not gone down so well for the DUP?
Yeah, well, so the UK government is now, they're trying to get out of the protocol themselves now, but they so basically, if you're to take a kind of a hard Brexit, implicitly that would mean that you would take the UK out of the single market and the customs union, including Northern Ireland. Now, because of the sensitivities around the Good Friday Agreement, the Irish government and some of the parties in Northern Ireland realised the danger of upending and upsetting that arrangement, especially the north-south element of those strands I mentioned earlier. And effectively, the protocol provided a special status for Northern Ireland, where it can be both within the UK's own market and within the EU's single market and customs union. And it was, in many ways, it was a sort of a win-win situation for them, where they could have both worlds, both the UK orbit and the EU's one. And the DUP felt that this was an affront to the Union, the Union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because basically, to protect the single market, the EU required that there would be border checks in some place or other, and if you put up border posts on the Irish border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, that's a real invitation to an escalation and potential conflict down the line, because the border posts, when they went up during the Troubles, were a constant target for paramilitary organizations. So the symbolism of that was just too dangerous in terms of what it could lead to down the line. So, as part of the protocol, there was an agreement to have some checks on the Irish Sea. So this is the implicit interference between the East-West dimension of the Good Friday Agreement was what the DUP found so objectionable. And because with the more, I suppose, the more hawkish Brexiteers within Westminster, they have also been pushing to remove the protocol, and it's used as a kind of battering ram every so often when the UK wants to get some kind of concessions from the European Union as part of their negotiations about what comes next in terms of a trade deal, etc. So it comes up every so often. It was again, in Northern Ireland, and as a post-conflict zone, you can never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. All of the solutions have an element of a fudge to them, because that means if one person is entirely happy with it, that means somebody else is put out. So they've all had an element of a fudge, and most of the adults in the room kind of accept that. But then when you have this kind of tub thumping, British nationalism emerging, and how vociferous that has been, these fudges become articles of faith, and they become a means by which they will wave that flag at home whenever it suits them politically.
I noticed a study by Queen's University in Belfast recently found that I think it was over 53% of those surveyed actually were happy with the arrangements with the current protocol, which is interesting in many ways. I constantly look for unity research papers and polls to indicate broader collective opinions, I guess, in Northern Ireland. That aren't along the lines of the political divide between republicanism and unionism. And I thought that was an interesting one. The majority thought that this.
Yeah, definitely is. And I suppose people who don't cling to a very strong kind of nationalist unionist orientation just want to get on with their lives. Like the great kind of John Hume quote, back in the 60s or 70s was that you can't eat a flag. And ultimately, people need to be able to feed themselves, work, educate themselves, raise their kids, whatever the case may be. And battling over whether you do so under a UK or an EU market doesn't really matter an awful lot. If you harpoon a fudge that allows you to do it, it's going to damage people's living standards. We already saw that even before all of the current crisis around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Cost of living had been going up in a good number of places anyway, but especially within the UK, they were having fuel shortages. They were having all sorts of difficulties in Britain that the protocol had been sparing Northern Ireland to a large degree. And that was becoming quite evident to people. And so people who might have grown up with the unionist background, but are pragmatic about just wanting to live their lives, that stuff is more important ultimately.
And I guess particularly as the scars and the wounds of 30 years of conflict and the troubles sort of moves away. Yeah. I mean, the last 3 years has felt like a decade, but 1998 or whenever the Good Friday Agreement was signed now feels like a lifetime ago, and that's multi-generational. Kids in the north have grown up not knowing this experience, so their perspective on life must be fundamentally different.
Completely, and I suppose that can cut both ways. Just I suppose to look the other angle on it, because there were riots in Belfast last year, and that was they were stoked by political stakeholders who should know better, who could come out and imply that the protocol had certain effects on unionist communities, which it did not, and ultimately it caused violence on the streets. That was enacted by people who were too young to remember the Good Friday Agreement, who might have only been born in the years since then. So that it is a worry that if people, that kind of political entrepreneur who sees an opportunity to use the threat of violence as leverage, it is something that we do need to watch out for, because people not being able to remember the conflict, it can cut both ways. They don't remember how serious and the suffering was, and the poverty that it caused, and the division, and for being honest about it, the people who were worst affected tended to be from working class communities on both sides of the divide. So it's anyone manipulating the political agenda for those purposes is something that we do need to be careful of.
David, it's an excellent point you make. Because as you said that reminded me as well. It's on both sides as well. We had that poor journalist get shot in Derry when there was
Larry McKee,
which is
and she was a brilliant example actually of someone emerging of that kind of post-sectarian generation. It was telling that even her funeral was an ecumenical service, and quite deliberately so by her family. I think she'd grown up, I think, in a unionist background. Her partner's from a nationalist background. Neither of them held to particularly nationally oriented identity. Just there is a collective Northern Ireland identity now of people who just want to get on with their lives. And the economic issues, the social issues do matter. And I suppose when it comes to it, people can inherit certain kind of political identities, and that's nothing new. It's not unique to Northern Ireland. But there can be a level of frustration with people harkening back to traditions that maybe don't resonate with them to the same degree.
I want to turn our attention to the question of Irish unity. And I guess it's fair to say that Brexit and the maintaining of an open border between the North and the Republic and a border on the Irish Sea between, that sort of East-West dichotomy you spoke about has sort of sparked this debate about borders and the idea of Irish unity. Give me your sense before we sort of dive into some more deeper kind of questions. Give me your sense of what is the mood on both sides of the border about the question of Irish unity. Has it started? Have you noticed that this question, this discourse, is starting to increase than it was, say, maybe 5-10 years ago?
Yes, it comes up a lot more often since Brexit, and I guess this is where the DUP made such a mistake in their gamble. Yeah, the DUP made a massive error in terms of how they approached Brexit, and there's a huge miscalculation. Within the Republic, it's forced the issue more than would have been the case otherwise. In principle, most Irish people would be in favour of unity eventually. It's just it's a matter of how, a matter of when, and those kind of considerations. In some respects, the presence of both the UK and Ireland within the EU made it less of a live issue, because the border was invisible. Fine, there was a change in currency when you crossed the border, and you change from kilometers to miles, and that kind of thing. But broadly speaking, if you go to like a Gaelic football match and cross the border, it feels the same as going to one within the Republic. And just the style of football is slightly different among the Ulster teams, but that's a different conversation. But yes, it has forced the issue to a degree. I know when you were speaking to Billy Sparks, the Labour Party General Secretary, she mentioned during that time that this kind of decade of commemorations, and that has also brought some elements of the so-called national question to the fore, to a degree that wouldn't have necessarily been the case in the earlier 2000s. So all of the commemorations of the centenary of the 1916 Rising, of the War of Independence and the Civil War, they all have also come at the same time as Brexit has crystallized people just thinking a bit more about Irish nationalism and its evolution. And then at the same time, the surge of Sinn Féin as a political force within the Republic has also forced the question that bit more. So, Sinn Féin they've been in power in a power sharing government in Northern Ireland for a good number of years now, and they are the main party of Irish nationalism within the North. They'd historically been relatively small in the Republic. In the early 2000s, they had only around 4 TTs, and now they're by polling the largest party, and in terms of their Dáil representation, they had a massive election in 2020. If they had run more candidates, they would definitely be the biggest party in the Dáil. So their surge as a political force has also made the question more readily apparent in the eyes of the media, but also the public more broadly. Now, whether that surge is an indicator of an increased sense of Irish nationalism, that's not entirely clear. Like there is maybe a tendency for some Sinn Féin representatives to interpret it as such, that this is kind of the imprimatur from the public for their view of how we should move towards Irish unity. In actual fact, they've also been fortunate in the political circumstances that's allowed them to grow, and they have been strategically effective in taking advantage of that. And that they've benefited from the years of austerity, the kind of socioeconomic angst that has come from that, and they've been seen as the kind of most potent force for change. So you've got a couple of dynamics playing out there as well. Now, within the Republic, Sinn Féin adopts quite a left-wing economic stance, which isn't always reflected in terms of how they govern in the north, but that's I suppose a side issue to some degree. But in reality, their priority is always going to be nationalism. It's even prior to the 2020 election, if you were to look at what their red lines were for going into coalition, it wasn't about the problems that we have with housing, or it wasn't their health service. It was about the red line was having a national, like a border poll, so a north-south referendum as to whether we should unify north and south. So that is their priority, and as long as they remain prominent, and it doesn't look like they're going to diminish in size anytime soon, it will remain a very live issue. And if it comes about that they are in government both north and south, that it's pretty inevitable. The calculations for other parties are that we do need to be careful in terms of how we bring the unionist community with us, because you can't, just having a head count and then telling a large minority in the northeast of the island that you're Irish now, you're part of this entity. That's not really especially conciliatory, and we don't want to repeat what happened within Northern Ireland in the opposite direction. So it does involve an awful lot of consideration as to how we characterise the Irish state if unity were to become a reality. So they're serious questions, and just having a very nationalist discourse is not going to be overly helpful in that.
I read an excellent article or interview in the Irish Times, which I think was last weekend, with the former Irish rugby internationalist Andrew Trimble. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see it yourself. He spoke about his perspective on Irish unity and Irish identity from a middle class Northern Irish Protestant unionist perspective. A couple of points that he mentioned in the interview I found incredibly insightful. He said that, and I'll quote, "The people in the Republic are not ready for a united Ireland. It feels like Southern nationalists or people in the South who would want or who would be campaigning for a united Ireland are not prepared to have that conversation or compromise. That's certainly the case amongst nationalists in the North." And he said, let's not oversimplify identity up here in Northern Ireland. Let's not try and pigeonhole people when it's way more complicated. Make an effort to understand just how potentially complex things are and people are, which I thought, was quite an astute observation for a professional elite athlete. Yeah. Talk to the points that he's speaking there. First of all, about the interesting that he said, I don't think people in the South are ready for united Ireland. What do you think he's going to there?
Yeah. So I guess, I suppose the tendency is sometimes for us to become defensive when someone says something like that. But the reality is, if we're serious about unity, we should be listening to what he has to say. And if that's what he feels, and he's not someone who has avoided engaging with the Republic. He played for our national rugby team. he still appears on Irish media as a pundit and that kind of thing during matches. So he's not someone with his head in the sand. He's not a throwback ultra unionist. So there are points that we should really listen to, and if he's saying we're not ready, we might feel that that's unfair, but then he might alternatively have a point, and we should look at what we need to do to be ready. And there will be difficult conversations if this comes to pass, about how we characterize the state, in terms of governance. Do we still maintain some kind of assembly in Stormont? Is there some kind of federative model of what that might entail? What do we do about other kind of symbolism, even the flag, the national anthem, that kind of thing? Ultimately, if the conception of Irish unity is one that is just assimilative and just subsumes the population and the territory, I would fear for what that will mean for our politics down the line and for social cohesion. So we do need to talk about that. There's also, there's an element that is definitely worth bringing up that has become sort of totemic for some people within the north, and that's the NHS. The NHS is a far more generous, and system than what the Republic has. Free at point of care and all that goes with it. So even amongst people in the nationalist community in Northern Ireland, they won't want to give that up too quickly. And we need to think about how we actually run our welfare state and how we're going to provide for people, on an all island basis. And then, what do you do about, like, Northern Ireland has a massive public sector, like far bigger, and that's again born of just post-conflict situation. It's there's a massive civil service. There are lots of different kind of layers of government that try to mitigate the worst extent of what caused conflict. So even just that whole administrative task of subsuming that corner of the island, it'll involve an awful lot of work, and we need to think about what that means in terms of costs, in terms of how it will affect people on a day-to-day basis, in terms of taxation to pay and all of that. So this is what I mean about people being in favour of unity in principle. But when they actually see the reality of what it means, we need to make sure people are on board with that, and that it doesn't cause resentment and division down the line. You could use the example of like the unification of East and West Germany, obviously far bigger entities than our little island, but it did have consequences in terms of how they manage their state as well. And we just need to be aware of that. And if people go into that with their eyes open and want to reach out a hand of friendship, and if it's done in that spirit, I would hope that we'd have a better time of it. But if it's just a case of going, okay, you're Irish now, you get with the program, that is not going to have a very positive outcome, I would fear.
It seemed that from what I read in the article, that there's the hardcore Ulster Unionist bloc that will be a tough group of people to move on this issue. But he also spoke about, don't look at the North through a binary kind of lens of green versus orange, but there's those shades of grey, which I hate using that term now, that sort of complicate this. And he was speaking about like the 23% of voters that don't vote for either a nationalist or a unionist party in the North. They vote for like the Green Party or the Alliance Party. I feel that he might have been indicating that he may be one of those types of people. It's that middle class, traditional, would have been Protestant, but have never really experienced what it was like growing up in the Shankill or the Falls. How critical are they to that discussion about Irish unity and what it means to be both, British and Irish at the same time?
They will be important, because that's your sort of bridge. If it does happen, they're the community in many cases who would be pragmatic about it. Because if again, we don't know what the constitutional arrangement would be. But let's say you have an all island government. And, when you're forming coalitions and this kind of thing, that's the type of government we're used to in this country. Those people who will just adopt the new order, and play ball, they'll be a very important bridge to social cohesion, to that kind of unity that isn't just territorial and isn't just subsuming of that population. Also, like, there already is interaction between the non-sectarian communities within Northern Ireland and those in the Republic. He's an example of someone who does so through his sport. There are people who do it through education, through business, through other forms of work or community engagement as well. And even within Northern Ireland too, there are people making significant efforts, not just in those middle class areas, but in working class areas. There's a very interesting woman called Linda Irvine, who's been leading an Irish language learning movement within loyalist communities in Belfast. She's become a very significant advocate of this, and an effort to reclaim it as something that there were people from the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. There were Gaelic-speaking communities amongst them in times gone by. Not that many, but they existed, and this kind of effort to help understand the geographical area's overall background, and hearing interviews with people who've taken her courses, just their appreciation they have for understanding the place name of their hometown better, or of where certain expressions come from that have fed into maybe Ulster Scots or have just fed into general English language discourse. People are making those kind of efforts, and often just on a local community scale, but that's where you can have real impact too, because it isn't just a kind of an ivory tower thing then of just people who can live a kind of cosmopolitan life doing so. You got people making those efforts across the community. It's just a matter of, I suppose, facilitating that and recognizing where those inroads can be made as well.
The article with sort of keep going back to this article, but it was funny when Andrew was talking about. You could almost see the internal conflict in his own mind, because he said, I had both a British passport and an Irish passport. I thought of myself as being both British and Irish, and obviously I played for the Irish national team, which is a 32 county All Ireland sporting team. And he said, but then again, at the same time, I never sung a Ron Vane when we played at Lansdowne Road. I don't know why I didn't do that. And he also said, like, I took my son to learn to play. Like, I never went and watched Gaelic football, but then I decided to take my son to go play Gaelic football. But then the coach wanted to change his name in Scoelga into Irish, and he reacted to that like, why are you doing that? But then he said, but then again, why did I react like that? Maybe I should have thought that was okay. Just this. People getting comfortable with the uncomfortableness of this divide. I've often articulated to some of my cousins and I said, you guys should join in the 12th of July parades just to try and take the heat out of it. Just let's hold hands and hug it out, right? They lost their brain at that idea. But this is the sort of the things we need to do, I guess.
Look, it's very telling. I spent a number of years living and working in Brussels, and it's fascinating when you see people outside of the context of Ireland or Northern Ireland, as the case may be. Now, I met a good number of people working for unionist parties when I was living there, and I was also involved in a Gaelic football team while I was there, and I played for them, but I also used to help coach one of the kids' teams. And I remember I was going to one of those kids' sessions one day, and this guy came along. He was a staffer for the UUP within the European Parliament, and that's the Ulster Unionist Party for your listeners. And he had brought his child along to learn to play Gaelic football, and the kid was loving it. Couldn't resist coming back again and again. And essentially what had happened was that, on your kind of a Friday or Saturday, you might bring your child to soccer or rugby training, and he was meeting kids from Dublin and Mayo and Cork and wherever else, and they were telling him, "Why don't you come on Sunday? We go to play Gaelic football." And these are his friends. He didn't want to be left out, and he went along. And his dad, was broad-minded enough to bring him as well, and loved it. And there was and got into that kind of sense of community as well. And I had another friend who actually, she was going out with a friend of mine, but she actually worked for Diane Dodds from the DUP. If you hear Diane Dodds speak publicly, she's actually pretty aggressively unionist, and doesn't appear overly pleasant. But my friend had tried to hang out with the British Conservatives when they were still there at the time, and ultimately found she had more in common with people from the Republic of Ireland, and was going out with a guy from Sligo, and and that kind of manufactured separation, which you can do within the context of being on this small island. It's harder to do when you're taking it out of water and we're all just living in Belgium. And you realize those commonalities. I sometimes come back to the tragic kind of situation of the death of Jo Cox in the UK, the British Labour MP, and her whole narrative of having more in common. And the reality is, when it comes down to brass tacks, like, we do have more in common with each other, in spite of the various annoyances and conflicts that come every so often in the political realm. People just want to get on with things, and by virtue of sharing this kind of same territory, there is commonality. It's just, I suppose, when people try to enforce one particular vision of what the territory signifies, or what one should behave like within that, that's when the problems emerge. There would have been a time when, like, the Gaelic Athletic Association banned its members from being involved in soccer or rugby, because they were seen as invader sports. And that was totally wrong-headed. Least of all, like, most of all, from from a kind of sports training point of view as well. But it was also damaging. It was divisive and damaging, and it alienated communities from them as an organisation. Similarly, not let your child be involved in Gaelic games, or to go to an Irish language class, or play trad music. It's not really going to do them any favors. You do see crossovers like that, by the way, in music as well, where you see collaborations between lambeg drummers and traditional music players as well. That's become more common too. So again, it's the thing of, like, ultimately, when you take the division out of it, people find common interests and can bring different flavors to the table.
I often head down to one of the local Irish pubs, of which there are many in my city, and there was one night. It was actually it might have been after an Irish class, I think. And one of the guys who was in my class, he was from Roscommon, was winding up his mate who was from County Antrim, and was from a unionist background. I think his name was like John or something. And he said, he was winding him up saying, "John, are you British or you're Irish?" And he wouldn't answer it, because he tells all the girls he's Irish, because he knows it's cooler to be Irish in Australia than to be British. So maybe what we should do is just bring everyone from the north out to Australia for a period of time and let them just assimilate with our culture, and then they can decide whether they want to be British or Irish.
Well, yeah, again, the commonality comes when you take people out of that situation, and and the whole thing of people having, like, those dual and multiple identities. In some respects, Ireland's become more accustomed to having net immigration in recent decades. And that changes things too, because you find more and more people who have those multiple identities. You could grow up here to Nigerian or Italian parents, whatever the case may be, and of course that always remains a part of who you are. But you're being raised as an Irish person, and I think we're getting more used to that. To having those various respective layers to how we view each other. And I would like to think as well that people who would have had those dual British Irish identities within the Republic over the years would feel maybe more comfortable expressing that too, because that was a problem, if we're being honest about it. In the years since independence, there were a lot of people in, I suppose, the Protestant minority within the Republic who still, would have certain kind of affinities with the British state, and would maybe have some kind of, and this is not everyone now, but there were people who maybe felt uncomfortable expressing it, and we do kind of need to be more accepting of that. Now it gets layered with other issues around, say, like the poppy around November and that kind of thing, and maybe the discourse around it is probably not helped by how forceful the UK media has been around this as well. And so the idea that if you don't wear it, that you're making a statement, which personally I find to be a little bit illogical. But
tell me about it. I'm a Celtic supporter,
yeah.
and Celtic don't put that poppy on the jersey, but every other team up and down the country in Britain, and Irish players get a lot of shit for it as well, playing down south in England as well. It's insane.
And like you see the abuse that happens to Irish footballers, and where you see like James McLean, for example. He's from Derry, and again, this goes back to the lack of the lack of awareness of what actually has happened within Northern Ireland in the name of the British state. So like the city where Bloody Sunday happened, and you're abusing a player from that city for not wearing something that where the funds go to the troops. It's it's a massive blind spot, and this is also like something that's possibly has the potential to toxify the conversation a bit more as well, is that the present government in Westminster is not shy about using populist appeal and a nationalist, nativist even appeal to shore up its base. And the manner in which they've gone about trying to putting in place an amnesty for British soldiers. Now, ostensibly, it's to avoid what they see as kind of vexatious suits towards soldiers based on what's happened in the Middle East. So they're trying to remove accountability there, but it's also disruptive in terms of the kind of reconciliation in Northern Ireland, because they didn't want to. They wanted to provide an amnesty to those soldiers who shot innocent civilians, within Northern Ireland, so in Ballymurphy or in Bloody Sunday in Derry, and it's been deeply unhelpful in terms of any kind of pacification of the situation there, which they've already been causing a good deal of trouble in terms of how they've managed the protocol on Brexit, and they're not shy about using conflict again and again to shore up their base.
Planting those traps that plant the seeds of division, the last thing we want. It should be the complete opposite of that. It's sowing, if I can take that analogy, sowing the seeds of love, and let those shamrocks and roses bloom together.
And like that's the difficulty you have when we're not dealing with a serious partner in the UK right now. The Boris Johnson government, they just and a lot of the people around them, they just don't care. They're quite happy to use this. Even like Priti Patel, mounting this kind of threat to try and starve Ireland into submission on one part of the negotiations. The funny thing is, Ireland has much stronger food security than the UK currently, anyway. But that's but the idea that would be a recourse as a negotiation tactic was pretty egregious. And another thing you need to watch out for over the next while is what efforts the UK government makes to wedge itself between the diplomatic inroads that Ireland has made over the years. So it's been quite telling during the period since the Brexit referendum. The kind of miscalculations that the British government has made with regard to how the EU would view the UK versus Ireland. So part of they've spent all this time trying to extract themselves from the EU that particular cohort of conservatives and other nationalists. They obviously didn't really appreciate this kind of pool sovereignty element that I discussed earlier, and as a result, they didn't really get what the EU does and how it operates. Like the European project was partially set up to protect those small states from the great power players. But in terms of the UK's kind of angst around the decline of empire and I suppose slightly wavering purpose in the world, they haven't really got this, and their assumption was that they could pick off the large players, France and Germany and Italy and Poland, um, and play them off against Ireland as a small country that wouldn't have the same kind of heft in terms of negotiations. It was an utter miscalculation because the European Union knows that they have to favour someone who's in the club over someone who is not, and also that as a peace project, the European Union as negotiators. So Michel Barnier first, and subsequently Maros Sefcovic, they've been really at pains to try and protect the provisions of the Good Friday Agreement that mitigate conflict.
I was super. I know he's not of our own political persuasion in domestic Irish politics, but I was super impressed with the Taoiseach and the way that the European Union negotiators had included him, and almost in some instances he was leading the conversations with Britain, which must have been driving the Conservatives, the Tories in the UK, absolutely bonkers.
Completely.
But
it's been quite interesting this week. I think it's today or tomorrow. So there's an EU Council meeting taking place, and there's also a NATO meeting taking place. So effectively, most of the NATO heads of government will basically transfer from the NATO compound outside Brussels into the European Council in Brussels. And Boris Johnson thought that he would just go along with this, even though he's no longer in the European Union. Because Liz Truss, his international trade minister, or Secretary of State, had done so in the previous version with her corresponding ministers. And they don't seem to understand that this is not how things work. They thought that they should be always at the table just because they're the UK. But this comes after Johnson just last week, he made this bizarre statement comparing the UK's efforts to extract itself from the European Union to the efforts of Ukrainians resisting invasion by Russia. It was so insulting, so offensive to, and frankly embarrassing. I do feel bad for British people who don't buy into his whole narrative, because it's pretty embarrassing for them, and it's pretty difficult to explain to anybody else, So like they don't seem to get that they're burning all these bridges, and while a lot of the time while they were in the European Union, like British people who bought into the project were really effective policymakers, really good at driving an agenda forward, because things would stall, and sometimes some of the British negotiators were very good at driving it forward, and that was a really positive contribution. But the ones who are dragging it back spent so long wasting everybody's time. And this goes back to even before Brexit. If you remember when David Cameron went on his weird little tour to try and renegotiate the terms of membership, and this is during a time when the conflict in Syria was escalating, and you'd massive movements of people across Europe, escaping wars, escaping all sorts of horror and degradation, and the European Union required a quick and effective response. And he used up so much time and political capital trying to negotiate Britain's place in the European Union, knowing full well it was not possible, and it was just for optics back in the UK. And there's a level of tiredness amongst so many of the European Union's leaders at having to indulge that kind of thing of basically indulging grandstanding that is for the benefit of the tabloid press in the UK, while everybody else is actually trying to do a job. It comes across as childish, self-centered, insular, and it became kind of evident, in those early days after the referendum and when negotiations were ongoing. Ireland had put in an awful lot of effort since since accession to the EU, but especially since the recession, to rebuild a reputation, after the banking crash and all of that, to having very positive outward diplomacy and building good connections. And when the Brexit vote happened, our diplomats moved quite quickly to shore up those connections. And while the UK was still, was basking in the kind of the post-referendum, the perceived glory of those who supported it, and then the various conflict around it afterwards as well.
Final question, because I've kept it too long already, but I just want to ask you a question a bit more about domestic politics. The Labor Party had a by-election a while. Well, I can't remember how long ago it was now, because I've lost track of time. When was this by-election? It was last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there you go. A year ago, in Dublin Bay South, and reading the reports at the time, it kind of looked like what I'd call a Melbourne Cup field of candidates running in this race, and Labor looked like an absolute outsider, but has come this no one believes in us win from nowhere, which was absolutely fantastic, and electing Ivana Bakic into the seat of Dublin Bay South. First of all, just talk us through that result. What was that win built on? Where did that success come from?
It was so much fun to be involved in that campaign, I have to say. As Dermot Ryan very well. Dermot was the campaign manager, but he put together a really good team of a number of us to run various aspects of the campaign. And honestly, I suppose when we came into it first, we knew what the national polling was saying about Labour and about our kind of capacity to mount any kind of challenge. And we also knew that we knew who had the advantage, and we knew that, say, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin had been making much of this kind of, I suppose, best of enemies situation, where each of them kind of pitting one party against the other would shore up their vote amongst their own base. And it was highly toxic, negative, and polarizing. And in the midst of that, we sat down and we calculated that there is an alternative approach to this, and that with Ivana's particular personal standing and her capabilities, that we can mount a very strong campaign that's positive, that's got a lot more hope to it than the toxicity of constantly telling everyone that they're crap. That if we strategize it properly, that we can at least get enough of a vote that she will be in the frame for a seat in the next time round. Initially, so we believed at the outset that it was possible to get a seat, but we knew that we had to at least aim that, when there's a full election, when you got the multi-seat constituency back, and it's not just for one position, that we at least needed to have a really good position for that. As things progressed and we put together our strategy and we figured out where we were targeting most, and we crafted our messaging and we developed our social media strategy and all of that. And we had ground to make up on that too, because both Sinn Féin and Fine Gael have tended to be the most effective parties when it comes to social media campaigning. And we did make up ground there. And we began to realize that we were getting pretty good traction, and things were working. And then this poll came out from the Irish Times, and it just had us a good deal higher in the running than we had anticipated at that point. And I remember we had a core team call when we knew the poll was coming out, and a few of us were already on the call. And I remember we're just kind of waiting, has anyone got it yet? And we're all looking at our phone while on a Zoom call like this, and then it came through, and this kind of giddiness went through the group. We're like, oh, we can actually win it. It's actually true. Our internal polling hadn't quite got to there yet. And of course, that poll itself, it gave this massive jump to us as well. Just the momentum went behind us more. And when it came down to the last couple of days, so like while I was doing most of my contribution was from my desk because I was, doing a lot of that kind of core team work. I like to get out on the canvas anyway. It makes it feel a bit more real rather than just kind of just typing on a laptop all day. So I did go out some evenings to canvas, and it was kind of nice to get a taste and a sense of how the public was reacting. But on the last day before the actual vote, I was canvassing in an area called Ringsend. It's near where I live, and it was weird because Sinn Féin were heavily targeting that area, right? And it was really old school campaigning that they were doing. Like it kind of seemed like either Fianna Fáil in the 70s or Pyongyang were the comparisons I saw, because they were going around in vans and tannoys with recordings of their party leader, urging people to get out to vote. And we knew that they were heavily targeting, and we were canvassing around there, and we were feeling good but nervous, and and I remember we were just about to finish up, and we're going to go and meet another canvassing team. And so we got on our bikes and we started cycling. But then we bumped into Ivana cycling the opposite direction. She was going around to the various canvas teams to campaign with us for a while. So we decided to stay a bit longer. And then the second time we went to leave, and as we were going, so someone shouted at her from a pub. So she went over to chat to them, and I was there were people. There's a pub next door, and I got chatting to some of the people outside that pub. And they were telling us like two of them had voted for Ivana number one and Sinn Féin number two, and the other guy voted Sinn Féin number one and Ivana number two, which is Sinn Féin voters historically, like prior to their current massive surge, they've been what you call plumpers. So in the Irish system, you vote 1, 2, 3, 4 the whole way down if you want. Sinn Féin voters historically just vote number one, and that's it though. Now that's changed as they've grown as a party, but because there'd been that kind of conflict between us and Sinn Féin sometimes in recent years, hasn't always been a common transfer pattern. But then we found, like in the tallies afterwards, an awful lot of people in that area did vote Sinn Féin one and transfer to Labour afterwards. So she had developed so there is a road back to us into those communities where Sinn Féin has pushed us to one side. But anyway, we moved on from that pub, and we were cycling up to meet the rest of the team. We were finishing for the night. We were going to meet the rest of the team and have one last kind of get together. And we're cycling along the Royal Canal. And it was when I really knew like this was something special was people started shouting, cheering from the side of the canal as we're on the cycle path going along, and just kind of go already congratulating her. Not a vote had been cast yet. People were already congratulating her, shouting her along, and just the kind of sense of fun and everything when we got to the pub later on, and just it was a kind of moment we had not had in quite some time. We've been through a rough few years since the time in government. Polling has not been good, and for her to upset, a situation where the party was polling at 4 or 5% around that time, and she polled at 30% in the election day itself, that was something else. And just it was really telling, just in terms of how we campaign and everything as well. Just what we need to learn from it as to how we actually approach, our standing in the overall political system. That we don't just offer kind of populist demagoguery, or we don't offer just negativity all the time. You can be in opposition and offer a kind of a program of change that's based on actually being constructive and engaging with people, and not trying to just stoke fear and anger all the time. We learned so much from it, and I just hope we continue to do so.
She's put her hand up for the leadership as well, which will be a fascinating insight into where the party goes. But I mean, first of all, that was a fantastic story. I felt like it ticked a lot of Dublin boxes there. There was bike riding. There was a lot of visits to the pub. It sounded like you're starting to quote Brendan Bain. I loved it. How many pints did you have after that particular canvass? I'll ask you that after the show. I think everyone that listens to this now wants to go and volunteer for the Labour Party in Ireland. It's going to be like that.
I've met Australian campaigners before. Get on board. You know what you're doing.
Well, I'll bring a plane load over if you pay for the charter flight. Look, I'm going to have to leave you there. I know you're in isolation, so technically I could lock you up for the next 6 or 7 hours, but I know you got other things to do, David. Can I say, Gaurav Miller Mahagat, for coming on the show tonight? I really, really appreciate it. It's been a fantastic chat, and we've covered a lot of the things. We've solved all the world's problems, certainly in your part of the world. We wish you and the party the best of luck going forward, and we hope to have you on the show maybe next St. Patrick's Day.
Great. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Stephen.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.